And now I'm gonna move on to, I'll try to be brief, I promise. I'll present you my diploma thesis topic. This is it. I actually have the thesis right here. I don't know if whoever is watching knows, but we most of the times need to print the thesis and actually bind it into this beautiful book. So it was nice to grab it again because nobody might ever do that in the future. But I will start with a little song, so I hope it can be, you can hear it, but I'll soon explain why. So here it is.
And that's the news on VOA to the Americas. I'm Kay Gallant in Washington. It's now 10:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Willis Conover is next with Jazz.
Time for jazz. Willis Conover in Washington, D.C. with the Voice of America Jazz Hour.
Okay, so that was just a little introduction. This was an intro to, as you hopefully heard, of Voice of America and a special program called the Jazz Hour by a moderator or host, Willis Conover. I'm going to mention his name again, but this was the topic that I researched I'm going to share my screen too, in my master's or my grad school studies of diplomacy at the University of Economics. So now we are moving on to a different university, Prague University, called the University of Economics. I will share my screen here. Let me know if you see it. Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Evie. I'm also gonna make it full screen. And so the topic of my master's thesis was the music as a tool of the US cultural diplomacy. And we are coming back in a circle to the time period or the focus that Thea had in her first presented research topic, and that's the Cold War, which is a fascinating time period. After the Second World War, basically, when the world became bipolar, we say, in international relations, and there were really two opposite poles that were not only, well, mainly ideologically opposed. And that's also something that I've been focusing on, because diplomacy and international relations and is a soft topic. It's really about relations between states, and during the Cold War between these two sides of the world. And I was focused on the United States and their cultural diplomacy. I focused on cultural diplomacy already in my undergrad studies, because that is a tool how countries interact and how a country is seen abroad by other countries and other people. So the efforts of cultural diplomats and cultural diplomacy is to present the home country in the best light possible, and which was especially important during the Cold War. I focused on music as a tool for this, because there are other tools of cultural diplomacy as art or theater, and actually visits, like international visits of famous people maybe to other countries. So there are many different tools of cultural diplomacy, but in my research I focused specifically on jazz. I'm gonna go over some main topics that I was dealing with. So I already explained US cultural diplomacy. the United States really focused on the power of cultural diplomacy already, or started focusing on it already after the First World War, actually. And there were different cultural exchange programs. The US was really exporting its culture abroad, and we can see the results nowadays. Everyone in the world has, in wealthy as well as poor countries, has an association or something connected to when we say US culture. So that's something that obviously I'm interested in my personal life as well, but in my thesis also. I was already mentioning the Cold War as the time period, so second half of the 20th century was my focus, and I was even more focusing not only on music in general, because the United States was already using music as a tool of cultural diplomacy prior to the Cold War, but jazz was the tool that not only played the role of music and culture, and that being kind of internationally understood and transferable, but also it had important elements, and those are my points below. And that was the idea of freedom and democracy and liberal values, which jazz was built around, and also listening to jazz really transported, and still until nowadays transports this feeling of freedom. But an opposing pole, again, within the jazz topic, was the question of racial segregation, and the fact that most of the jazz musicians were African Americans, who at that time were very much discriminated against. And same as, yeah, I might mention more specifics about jazz a little bit later, but jazz was the focus. And I was looking into the program of jazz ambassadors. That's how they were called by the US government. The official program was from 1956 until 1978 of the US government sponsoring tours of jazz musicians going to the parts of the world that we have also mentioned, and that was the Eastern Bloc. So all of a lot of the Central European and Eastern European countries, mainly the Soviet Union, but also Poland and Czechoslovakia, and also Asia and Africa, which I briefly mentioned in my research, but didn't really focus on. So those were my topics, and I was looking into this, and my research question was, who actually made a bigger contribution? Was it the American government who founded these jazz tours, sponsored them, and financially supported them, and also passed laws or acts that guaranteed continuity of this program even after elections? Or was it individuals? Was it who participated in the promotion of jazz during the Cold War? So that was my research question, and I can already start with sharing this quite important New York Times article, which was called "The United States Has a Secret Sonic Weapon: Jazz as a Secret Weapon." So they already used the terminology, the editor of this article, Felix Belair Jr., in 1955 used the terminology of war, which Cold War was an ideological war, but he used the comparison of jazz being a weapon. That's how important of a role it played in the strategy, the jazz strategy of the United States government, of the State Department. So as I mentioned, main question was who played a bigger role? Was it the government or the individuals that participate? Was it the jazz musicians and individuals about focused on jazz? So government. Why did they choose jazz? I think I already explained that. Those were the capacity of jazz being understood by people of the East. One of the countries where these jazz tours were organized was back then Czechoslovakia, where jazz actually became popular already in the mid-20s, and it was a way of kind of protesting the current regime, actually, then later on in the second half of 20th century. So jazz was a very strong, it created really this feeling of liberty in the part of the world that was really not free. And so that was the main reason why they chose jazz. The main actors of the US government was the Department of State, which actually now I'm gonna look up some dates. So we're talking now mid-50s when this all started. The Department of State started this so-called CPP. Those are the abbreviations in my presentations. I'm gonna just translate them for you. The CPP was the Cultural Presentations Program of 1954, and its official goal was to resist the Russian propaganda. So it'd be a whole other topic talking about how, what was the Eastern Bloc's or Soviet Union's response to all of this. But the CPP, the Cultural Presentations Program, had this goal to resist the Russian propaganda, which is also very strong. Then we have the ACA, which was the Advisory Committee on the Arts under the Department of State. That was a unit that helped to select the musicians. They actually were specifically trained prior to their Euro tour, kind of ideologically trained what they were supposed to say, what they were not supposed to say, because as I mentioned, it was a government strategy. It was not just a concert. And then there is UCIA, which is the United States Information Agency, and that was that also played a big role in this. They were sponsoring pamphlets and recordings of jazz music and exporting it. They even one time bought these smaller radio, like transistor radios, and gave them out for free in the destination countries of these jazz tours for people to listen to jazz even at home. So that was the big role of UCIA. The group of the jazz musicians that were sent abroad were called jazz ambassadors. And there was a big, as I already mentioned, the controversy with jazz, it being used as a weapon against the Soviet bloc and ideology, but also the racial aspect of it, and basically jazz being performed by musicians who were not free in their home country. So that was a big dilemma. And also jazz ambassadors, actually I can just show you here, there was a musical written by Dave Brubeck and his wife Yola Brubeck, jazz musicians, with all those musicians in there, a musical called The Real Ambassadors, and that was a satirical musical about really focusing on this racial question and how these musicians were approached by the government, how they were really trained to say certain things. And this musical can be still found on LPs and probably in digital form as well, and that's an interesting one. And back in and almost done with the government aspect of it, one more governmental institution or player, or two of them actually, which were sponsored by the government money, or with the government money, was the Voice of America, a radio station, which was also founded and then financially supported by the Department of State. And we already heard the jazz, it's jazz special. Voice of America was, yeah, I'm not gonna get further into it. And then FOMUSA, which was Friends of Music USA, which was a special program under the Voice of America, and they also focused on supporting the jazz musicians, also funded from government money. So this was the government's role in all of this. I already mentioned The Real Ambassadors, a very interesting musical. Again, cannot get into it, but very satirical, very funny. And now we have on the other side the individuals. So I could probably talk, because I'm very much interested in them, about each and specific of the musicians. For my thesis, I chose 3 of them, which was Dizzy Gillespie, or his real name was John Burks Gillespie, but he was a trumpet player, and he was the first official jazz ambassador that performed in Poland. Then there was Dave Brubeck, who was also the author of the previously mentioned musical. He was a jazz pianist and composer, and again, we're not here to talk about their lives, even though they were very interesting. And then Louis Armstrong, probably most well-known African-American jazz musician, who actually was the main kind of main actor when it came to being really real. So even though all of these musicians were trained about what to say during their tours, he still was being himself and very authentic. So there are reports and from his fans and from all of those countries where he actually was addressing the racial segregation, the topic of the problematic topic that actually the Soviet bloc countries were using against, again, we were talking about the Russian propaganda, they were using it against these US sponsored tours. Then there is Willis Conover, another very important individual. We heard his voice at the beginning of my presentation. He was the host of the Music USA Jazz Hour program, which, if I remember it well, started in 1955 and went on until the 80s, really. He was a long-term radio host, and many people still talk about his velvet baritone voice and have it very much connected to the jazz. And you can look up on YouTube many of his Jazz Hour recordings, which is really nice. And then other individuals such as Senator Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who actually came up with the proposal of creating the CPP, the Cultural Exchange Program that I mentioned at the beginning. So even behind those government decisions was this individual we know was friends with Dave Brubeck, and he actually initiated this all. And also mentioning the Columbia Records producer, George Avakian, who in fact was the main person who produced the jazz, mainly of Louis Armstrong's recordings that were then distributed around the globe, either legally or illegally, or yeah, in any way possible into those countries. So those were the individuals. So these musicians really played an important role in the US diplomacy and really fighting this ideological war against the Soviet Union. there is one question or one answer to my research question, who played a bigger role, but I can definitely say, or that was the result of my research, that even though the US government supported all of this and had a clear mission with their jazz ambassadors and sending them to Europe, but if it wasn't for these individuals who really made it happen, I don't think it would be really possible. So the result was of my research was that it was really thanks to those people who understood the power of jazz back then. So thank you for your attention. This is all from me. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. And this is probably it. Thank you for the applause. I don't know if anyone has...
I have a question. I have a question.
Yes.
How much would you say that the fame of Louis Armstrong owes to the fact that he was the ambassador? Because, you know, he is known, he's been known, you know, he's the star #1. But, you know, if you could assess the level to which it helped him or internationally.
Yeah, I understand this question, and I was also thinking about it, but then reading materials about, for instance, there were some Czech music fans and jazz people who focused on the Cold War jazz and even jazz before the Cold War. And Louis Armstrong, my guess is that Louis Armstrong would have become famous even if it wasn't for those jazz tours. So he really was special. His recordings or records got distributed, even undercover, got to the people. So, and he openly kind of sabotaged the ideological underlying message under these government tours. So, yeah, my guess is that he would have been still very famous. Yeah.
Thank you. It was great.
Question. All right. Unless there are any other questions, I'm gonna finish our first ever NYU Prague TED, as we called it, thesis presentation. Thank you everyone for presenting. Evie.
Hold on, I have one more thing. Could we all unmute our microphones and thank Tina for hosting by giving her applause?
That's what I wanted to do.
Yes, thank you, Tina.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for a wonderful presentation.
And thank you, Sia, for the idea.
Yes.
Yes, yes, thank you. So, goodbye everyone. Thank you for listening.
Watching. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.